Now, you used a term just a second ago that I want to make sure that everyone understands what the term is. It's you said judicial review. What
Yep.
do you mean by that term?
A judicial review, meaning the power of the judiciary, but specifically the Supreme Court, essentially to rule on duly legislated, duly enacted legislation, ruling it unconstitutional. So being a check against, but that also stands for the executive, and that's for state laws as well as federal laws. So whether it's a legal act done by an executive or done by a legislature, the courts and specifically the Supreme Court can strike it down. And I connect this in my work. I connect this with this Thomas Aquinas philosophy, which actually goes back even to Augustine, which is the idea that an unjust law is no law at all. And in our system, a law must be constitutional. You must be able to derive a logical and rational connection to an enumerated power in the Constitution for a government to be allowed to do it. And if our Congress passes a law that doesn't reach that bar, it's the role of the Supreme Court to say, you might have passed that law, but it's not really a law and nobody has to follow it. And therefore, it's null and void.
Yeah. You sent me over something to read of your work, and I'd like to just read a little passage from it if I can. You said, this brings into focus the objective of this thesis. The American judiciary has come to represent a unique and essential aspect of the American project, defender of the Constitution against the inappropriate and illegal aims of the executive and legislative branches of both state and federal powers. Perhaps the most important of all, however, is an altogether different feature of the court and of its judicial review power, which is the judiciary's role in to act as an instrument of rights theory against the unconstitutional and even undemocratic elements of the American regime. So, how does this thesis overlap with what you see happening to the Supreme Court, kind of like right in front of our eyes? Help us link these things together.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe to do that, we need to talk about this politicization some more. Like I said, the Supreme Court was not constructed to be a political body the way the others are, and supporters of either party, and even some independents, to be fair, are guilty of acting as though, I guess I'll put it this way, too many people act as though the Supreme Court is the third house of the legislature. Right? They act like there's the house with the most people, and that's the House of Representatives, and then the next house, which is the Senate, has 100 senators, and then there's the third house that has 9 justices. But that's not how the court works. The court is not only an undemocratic body, it's intended to be an anti-democratic body. And so when people think of the court and judicial nominations in political terms, Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus progressive or liberal, they are undercutting, they are subverting the very idea of what the court is supposed to be.
Which is, yeah, it was. So if I can just bring this together, just because I'm dumb and slow sometimes. So what the court is supposed to be is this body that acts that functions to judicial review, right? Yeah. To look at laws that have been passed either at the federal or the state level to say this is constitutional or this is unconstitutional.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And in my work, I'm positioning it amongst rights values because judicial review as a power of the Supreme Court became really, really important throughout, especially the 20th century and into the 21st century. And that's partly why it got politicized, because it became more central to people's lives. A Supreme Court decision it suddenly had more immediate ramifications. Think about Board versus Brown of Education, or Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. In one decision, the segregation of the races in public schools was erased. It had immediate impacts. Now, to be realistic about its history, it didn't begin to get enforced everywhere as immediately as it was supposed to be. But the decision was made and the ball began to roll, if you will. And many decisions over the past 50 to 100 years that have been through the court have really shaped our culture. And so it's understandable why the stakes are seen as being so high with the Supreme Court and who's on it. And we are better, in part of my thesis is that we are better for having a court that practices judicial review, because historically, at least for the past 50 to 100 years, it has expanded the recognition of rights for people in that period of time. So it's a really important power. It's a really important body. But because it is an anti-democratic check, people should not be looking at it as, I want all democratically appointed justices or all Republican appointed justices. Mm-hmm. And by the way, and we can talk more about this if you want, but to assume that a justice is appointed by a Republican so they're going to be conservative has not proven to be true. Yes. And the opposite also has not proven to be true. John Roberts, current Chief Justice, was appointed by George W. Bush. He upheld Obamacare, to the horror of conservatives, across the nation. Earl Warren, governor of California, who became Chief Justice, appointed by Republican President Eisenhower, I believe, was thought that his jurisprudence was going to be conservative, and he ended up leading one of the most liberal courts in history, where a lot of progressive decisions ended up coming down. So this is also the problem with people thinking about the Supreme Court and Supreme Court nominees in these kind of political terms. They get on the bench, and because it's a lifetime appointment and they're not being voted for ever again, and they're not voted in except by the Senate, they are designed to be disconnected from the politics. That's a good thing. Yeah. And now it can make that sort of, the defying of expectations dangerous to what we might want. But I saw you nodding. You know what I'm talking about. You can't just know how somebody's going to rule because they were appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that there would be such a freedom in that to be able to explore ideas and look at things in different ways that people who are elected to Congress or the presidency, they don't have that, because one of their main objectives is going to be to win re-election again. So that's going to be constantly on their mind, where as Supreme Court justices, they don't have that. And so I guess would you say that the opposite of judicial review would be like a more activist judge? Do I have that right?
Actually, that's a buzzword that I have a problem with.
Okay.
Is activist, because, and this is what's interesting about the idea of judicial review, is depending on the political era, it changes as to which party is against it. So in the early 20th century,
of course.
Yeah. In the early 20th century, it was the progressives who were against the idea of judicial review. And basically from the progressive era through FDR, because the Supreme Court was constantly rejecting, nullifying legislation that the progressives were wanting passed. And Supreme Court kept saying, you can't do this. It's not constitutional. Mm-hmm. But go to the 1960s through the 1980s, and progressives loved judicial review because the courts were making decisions that they liked. And so therefore, conservatives and Republicans hated judicial review. And that's largely where you started to hear the term judicial activism. And honestly, it doesn't matter who's saying it. Judicial activism is essentially a decision that somebody doesn't agree with. Mm-hmm. Now, there are certainly times when the Supreme Court has made a decision that I have personally not understood how is that a constitutional ruling? And I might in some way think it's activism because they're pushing for a policy that can't be found in the Constitution. And I think that's what people mean. But it's used so loosely, and it's been used by Democrats and Republicans alike, that I don't think it's a term with much meaning.
No, that's an incredibly fair point. So, of the Supreme, and I may be asking questions that are kind of like outside. I don't know what your specific knowledge is on this stuff. So I'm just going to probe, because you're really smart and you know a lot of stuff. Would you say that that of the justices that are currently on the bench, do you think that they are or are not adhering to the philosophy of judicial review specifically as like their primary obligation?
Meaning upholding the Constitution?
Yeah.
There's always cases that you disagree with, but I actually, there are particular members of the court that I agree with more than others. But yeah, so there was an article I published last year for the Oregon Encyclopedia. It's just this short entry of this Supreme Court case called Maytal v. Tam. And it has to do with this Portland dance rock band, the Slants, and their case went all the way to the Supreme Court. I reached out to them when I was writing the article, and I was able to interview them for my podcast. They're a really interesting group of guys, but they're a group of Asian American musicians who called themselves the Slants. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to trademark their name, and the trademark office says you can't, it's against the trademark administrative rules, which have the force of law, to trademark something that can be seen as disparaging to a group of people. Mm-hmm. So the Slants were being kept from trademarking their name because the Slants was supposedly disparaging against themselves. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so they had to challenge that, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and an 8-0 decision. Gorsuch had been nominated. I think he'd been appointed, but he hadn't been there to hear the case, so he didn't rule on it. But in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court said, yeah, this is absurd. Of course, people have the right to trademark whatever name they want. And I completely applauded them for doing so. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to write that article. These things happen actually all the time. And it's one of those other things that people look how outraged people are about the Supreme Court right now. How many of them have been paying attention to the Supreme Court cases over the past several years?
I'm going to bet not a lot. No.
Yeah. I doubt many people know about the Maytal v. Tam case, but that was a clear free speech issue, and every member of the court, and Gorsuch would have ruled this way because we know that he's good 100%. On free speech.
Yep.
He would have ruled this way too if he could have. They all agreed that this was a violation of the First Amendment. They nullified an antiquated and completely unconstitutional administrative rule in the trademark law, and they did the right thing. And they were all in agreement about it. Mm-hmm. That just for the principle involved in that case, it should have been a bigger story. But we don't get news stories. The Supreme Court all agrees on something, right? It's always the divisive stuff that gets attention.
Right, exactly.